almost 700 pages long in English without any Persian in there. So this really was kind of a blockbuster to me when I saw it. I mean, I've just seen this a few weeks ago, to know how much Kiarostami, how much poetry he created. And this is not only original poetry, it's also sort of versions and translations of some classic poets like Rumi that are known in the West as well. So tell us about Kiarostami and poetry and how you got involved with this.
Yeah. Abbas has 3 books of his own poetry. They're very, very personalized versions of poetry that you can see the Abbas's signature on them. They're very similar to Japanese haikus. And Abbas also started to publish some books, selections from Persian contemporary and classic poets, including the big names like Rumi, Hafiz, Sadi, Nima, and also he created a specific project called Night, which he was searching for the topic night within the Persian classic and contemporary poetries. And I know Abbas had some other projects that I think he could not finish them. The fact is that how we started that, my friend Paul Cronin was writing a book and was searching for poetic cinema and role of poetry in Kiarostami cinema. And then we started working on some of Abbas's poetry, and after a while it became some sort of a journey for us because we found a lot of poetic motifs in these poetry books and also in Abbas's film, and I'm sure people can find these motifs in other Abbas's works, including probably his photography and other works. For example, I will give you an example, the notion of a child that you usually see in Kiarostami's films. For instance, in this movie, at the beginning, the main characters were asking the address. And that part actually is based on the poetry by Sohrab Seperi, is a contemporary Persian poet that he also used to live in New York for a short time when he was alive. And basically some of the words is exactly the same as Sohrab's poetry, and the name of that poetry is Where is the Friend's House, which is the name of the title of one of Abbas's films. And it's interesting that in that poetry, Sohrab Seperi is mentioning some sort of stages on a path that you can find a friend or or a beloved or friend or someone that's who is a beloved. And finally, in that poetry, the horse rider, which is the main character, will find a child up on a tree and ask the address. And the child, I mean, is the person that can show the address. The same thing you saw in the film. And in the last scenes of the film, you saw that the main character was looking for his friends, and the child didn't want to help him, and he couldn't find the friends. These motifs are also, you can find them in Abbas's poems. And the other thing that Godfrey mentioned was nature images, that you can see them, a lot of these images in forms of poetry in Abbas's poetry, his own poetry. The other thing that we found was that the tendency to go out of the city, which you see in a lot of Abbas's adaptation from Nima's poetry, because Nima is actually a poet who is some sort of link between traditional poetry and modern poetry. And when we're looking at the Abbas's adaptations of Nima, you see a lot of indications of how Nima wanted to get out of the big city of Tehran and go to nature, go to his own village and explore the nature. Something I should mention, which I think is important to understand Abbas's work, is that in Iran, poetry is very important, like cultural. I read a quote in Darius Shaigan's, one of Darius Shaigan's quote, that before Iranian Revolution, the wife of one of the great Greek writers went to the city of Shiraz, which there is tomb of Hafiz and Sa'di, two great Iranian poets. And the lady was surprised because in Iran people treat these tombs like holy shrines. And I think it's unique. You can't see it in other parts of the world. And there was also something interesting because you saw that the physician, the child, and everybody in the movie were sometimes just reading or reciting some poetry, because some of these poetries basically have entered to the common culture as proverb. People use it in daily conversations. Yeah. And it's also important that look at this from this angle, that I think also in Iran, Abbas is very charismatic, as if just even people who are not very involved in cinema really respect him, like how they respect the great poets of Iran. And that's some important thing, that you look at poetry in Iran from this angle.
Yeah, I read the analogy that poetry is to Iranians like opera is to Italians. Like everybody knows it, everybody grows up hearing it all the time. It's not a matter of class, it's not a matter of education, everybody in the culture knows it. And Abbas told me he felt sure he knew by heart more poetry than any other Iranian filmmaker, and he could just quote it for days. So it was very, very important to him. I think it really informed his sensibility, and not just the Persian poetry, but he knew a lot about Western poetry. And one of the first times I met him, we talked about Ezra Pound and Lynn Carlos Williams and people like that. He knew all about this stuff. So yeah, that was a very big thing.
Yeah, the other thing that I should mention is another quoting motif in Abbas's work is the notion of the path, and probably that's coming from some sort of mystical, or let's say in general, Sufism, because it's very hard to define Sufism. But there's some sort of mystical notion of the path, and usually in Persian mystical traditions, people usually get onto a path, they explore outside world, and then they explore the nature, they explore the greater world, which is their heart or inside, and through this path, everything is planned. From any incident, you learn something, and finally, I think the main character in this movie just learned a lot. At the end of the movie, everything was some sort of set to teach him something. So it's some sort of the notion of path. You see a lot of this motif in both Abbas's original poetry and also his adaptations from great Persian poets. And something else that I should mention is that the film will carry us, as the main character actually read the poetry in the film, is from Farrokhzad. And basically, you saw that Farrokh was talking about the darkness. And this poetry was published in a book called Another Birth. Yeah. So, and it was interesting that like the notion of birth, death, and life, how they were playing together in this film, and how the main character was searching for finding these things together from just what is the meaning of life, what is the meaning of death, and probably leading to a new way of rebirth or another birth. And I think some of these motifs have been very, very intentionally put in Abbas's work by himself, or even unconscious, because Abbas was carrying a lot of this poetry in his own life and his own works.
Right. Well, Farrokh is,
I was going to say that. I just wanted to make sure the audience had time.
Yeah, let me finish one again here. Farrokh is a great modernist poet. She died in her 30s. She's won the Sylvia Plath Award or something like that. And
also Farrokh was a filmmaker.
She was a filmmaker. She made a film called The House is Black. It's 20 minutes long. It's one of the most important ones.
Check that out if you can find it.
Yeah, and so there is her poetry, there's some traditional poetry here. It was interesting that the climactic poem is by Omar Khayyam, who is a very interesting figure because people want to see Sufism in him, and people also want to see absolute skepticism.
Yeah, Omar Khayyam is a really controversial figure, and people have different ideas, but the main theme of Khayyam's poetry is probably is related too much to probably Epicurus tradition means that you should live in time, don't think about the past or future,
Exactly.
and maximize your enjoyment, and that's the meaning of life.
Yeah.
And I know that Abbas also had some adaptation from Khayyam's poems. And this is interesting because Khayyam's poems are very, very short, the shortest format that you can have in Persian traditional poetry. And I don't know how Abbas could select from them, and it's very interesting. I don't know if the book is going to be published or not, but Abbas told me that the book was ready even before he died.
Well, when I saw him in Tehran, and after this film and coming out the rest of the world, he said they wouldn't give him permission to release it in Iran. I said, why? He said there were 5 things, and one of them was Omar Khayyam. After 900 years, and he being one of the great iconic figures in Persian culture, they still can't get their arms around it. So I don't know if this film ever got released. But your questions, please. Because
this is in some ways, I think it's a frustrating film if you haven't seen a lot of Kiarostami before.
I hope it intrigues people who have enough to try to go in. This is a real, different kind of poetic cinema.
Good.
The more you see all the associations and all this other work, the deeper you go, and the more you appreciate it and enjoy it too.
So on that note, do you guys have questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just intrigued by, I didn't connect Mrs. Godarzi with Godar and God, and that completely is like a huge thing because he's driving up the hill to talk to Godarzi, God, and coming back, and that's a huge thing. So it was interesting because Mrs. Godarzi is asking him, like, is she dead yet? Like, and if we were to connote her with God, then
she's a false god.
Then it's like he's saying, the filmmaker is saying, God is asking this human if another human is dead. It's
right,
like,
and say, can't you hurry it up?
yeah. So isn't that interesting? I don't know how does that.
It is. I mean, it is sort of like suggesting that the culture that these guys come out of, this technological culture that just is out to exploit people, is not the path to the higher truth.
Godarzi is a common family name in Iran. So I think the reason I was selected that was I don't know, because if I didn't know like English or just people don't get that type of interpretation that it's related to God or something. And I think it's very common family name.
Oh, like you mean it's a common, like people actually have that name, or it's a common like literature name?
No, it's a common, people have it. You can.
Oh, okay.
I think probably I was selected that because it's a very common name.
Other questions? Keep thinking, but we can't talk about the Wind Carrius and not talk about all the characters who you never see. There are so many characters who you either only glimpse, or you never see their face, or you never see them on screen in any capacity whatsoever. There's probably a dozen.
There's 11 according to Abbas.
11, almost a dozen.
Yeah, exactly.
Off-screen voices.
Right.
And what do we make of that?
Well, what he sort of alluded to when I talked to him about it is that he has as a basic model of what he's doing is creating a cinematic poetic language. It's kind of equivalent to modernist poetry. And a lot of poetry, a lot of stuff is left out. It's almost you strip away a lot of stuff. You have other things. And that Kiarostami said he made half-made films in which a lot of stuff was left out, so the audience has to supply it and figure out the meaning and plug into it. But this is certainly the only case where he was left out, a whole bunch of people. I think it's something he probably always wanted to do, actually. But there's also sort of a mystical dimension of that. There's the invisible that is behind what is visible that we need to seek.
And I think that sort of idea of half-made or unfinished films is something that can be very frustrating when you first experience them. Not a lot of filmmakers put that much trust in the audience.
Exactly.
Not as many have the respect for HB or that Kiarostami does.
Right. I have a feeling that Kiarostami's reputation is going to go on and on and get bigger and bigger because the more people encounter this stuff and the more they actually get into it, the more important it becomes, and the more he seems like a great counterexample to all those filmmakers that feed easy meanings to people rather than asking people to be a part of their work.
Yeah, there was also another poetic motif about one of the characters. The guy was digging probably a hole or grave or something. His name was Yusuf, which is Joseph.
Joseph
And,
of the well.
and it was a Joseph and it was a very, very common story in Persian literature, and you can see like the name of Joseph in many of Abbas's adaptations.